There is a moment in war when geometry becomes weaponized, when the angle of a machine gun and the shape of a trench determine who lives and who dies, when a single man standing on the back of a steel vehicle makes a decision that traps 40 soldiers in a space they cannot escape. On a hill southeast of Rome, in the final days of May 1944, a captain from Montana who had never led men in direct combat solved a problem that had killed dozens of American soldiers in a single afternoon. He used the weight of a tank destroyer, the mathematics of blocked exits, and a .50 caliber machine gun firing downward into a confined space. What happened in those 90 seconds would be studied in military academies for decades, not because it was heroic in the traditional sense, but because it revealed something fundamental about warfare that Doctrine had not yet codified. This is the story of how civilian experience, applied geometry, and the impersonal physics of overwhelming firepower collapsed a German defensive position that artillery could not touch and infantry could not survive. The spring of 1944 found the Allied armies in Italy locked in a campaign of grinding attrition that had consumed months and tens of thousands of lives. The invasion of the Italian mainland, launched in September of 1943 with the promise of a swift advance northward, had instead devolved into a series of brutal positional battles across mountainous terrain ideally suited for defense. German forces, though strategically on the retreat across Europe, had transformed Italy into a killing ground of carefully prepared defensive lines, each one requiring frontal assaults that exhausted Allied divisions and delayed the liberation of Rome. By January of 1944, the Italian front had stagnated along the Gustav Line, anchored by the fortress monastery of Monte Cassino, where repeated Allied offensives shattered against German positions without achieving breakthrough. In an attempt to break this deadlock, Allied command authorized Operation Shingle, an amphibious landing at Anzio, a coastal town 30 miles south of Rome, designed to outflank the Gustav Line and threaten the German rear. The landings on January 22 initially achieved tactical surprise, putting ashore more than 36,000 troops with minimal opposition. But instead of exploiting this advantage with an immediate advance inland, the Allied commander consolidated the beachhead, allowing German forces time to react. Within days, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had redeployed units from across Italy, encircling the Anzio perimeter with a ring of steel. What was intended as a bold stroke to unlock the Italian campaign became instead a 4-month siege, with Allied forces trapped in a coastal pocket barely 7 miles deep, subjected to constant artillery bombardment and periodic German counterattacks that nearly pushed the invaders back into the sea. The Anzio beachhead became a bleeding ulcer, consuming reinforcements and supplies while producing no strategic gain. By late May, with the Gustav Line finally cracking under renewed Allied pressure at Cassino, the moment had come to break out from Anzio and link up with forces advancing from the south, completing the encirclement of German forces and opening the road to Rome. The German Caesar Line represented the last continuous defensive barrier between the Anzio beachhead and the Italian capital. Unlike the more famous Gustav and Adolf Hitler lines to the south, the Caesar Line was improvised under intense time pressure, but it was no less lethal for its hasty construction. German defensive doctrine, refined through years of Eastern Front combat, emphasized depth over linear strength, creating interlocking fields of fire from positions that were mutually supporting and difficult to suppress with artillery alone. The Caesar Line exploited every feature of the rolling volcanic terrain south of Rome, positioning machine gun nests and anti-tank guns on commanding heights with overlapping sectors of fire. One of the most formidable positions in this defensive network was Hill 209, a volcanic rise southeast of the town of Lanuvio, crowned by Villa Crochetta, a stone farmhouse converted into a strongpoint. The hill's military value derived from its observation and fields of fire, dominating the approach routes that American forces would have to use in any breakout toward the Alban Hills and Rome beyond. German engineers had fortified the position with characteristic thoroughness despite limited time. Deep trenches snaked across the hillside in zigzag patterns, their walls revetted with timber and sandbags, wide enough for soldiers to move through at a crouch, but narrow enough to limit blast effects from artillery. At intervals along these trenches, dugouts had been excavated into the volcanic soil, roofed with logs and earth thick enough to withstand anything but a direct hit from heavy artillery. These dugouts served as shelters during bombardment, and as firing positions once shelling lifted, allowing defenders to survive preparatory fires and then emerge to engage attacking infantry at close range. The trench system was not a simple line, but a complex network with multiple firing bays, traverses to limit enfilade fire, and carefully sighted machine gun positions that could sweep the open ground infantry would have to cross. The Maskinengewehr 42, known universally as the MG-42, was the finest general-purpose machine gun fielded by any army in World War II, and it dominated defensive combat in a way few weapons have before or since. Firing at a cyclic rate of 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute, the MG-42 produced a sound unlike any other weapon on the battlefield, a continuous ripping tear that American soldiers described as like tearing canvas or ripping cloth, a sound so distinctive and terrifying that it became synonymous with German defensive firepower. Where American and British machine guns fired in distinct, individual shots even during sustained fire, the MG-42's rate of fire was so high that the sound blurred into a continuous buzzsaw roar. This extreme rate of fire served a tactical purpose beyond simple volume of bullets. It meant that any soldier caught in the open during a burst had almost no chance of survival. The gap between rounds was measured in fractions of a second, far too brief for even the fastest reflexes to react. A 2-second burst put 40 to 50 rounds downrange, enough to cut a man in half or sweep an entire squad. The weapon was also mechanically reliable, designed for rapid barrel changes that allowed sustained fire for extended periods without overheating, and it was versatile, equally effective from a bipod as a light machine gun, or mounted on a tripod for sustained fire missions. German Doctrine assigned 2 MG-42s to each infantry squad, organizing tactics around the machine gun rather than the rifleman, and German defensive positions were invariably built to maximize machine gun fields of fire. At Hill 209, multiple MG-42s were positioned in the trench system, their crews trained and experienced, their weapons sighted to cover every approach an attacking force might use. For American infantry tasked with assaulting such a position, the MG-42 represented a nearly insurmountable problem. Artillery could suppress the guns temporarily, but the moment the barrage lifted, crews emerged from dugouts and resumed firing. Tanks could provide fire support, but on broken volcanic terrain with limited visibility and the threat of German anti-tank weapons, armor could not approach close enough to engage trenches directly. Infantry assaults had to be made across open ground, and the moment soldiers rose from cover to advance, the MG-42s opened fire. On the morning of May 29, 1944, the 1st Battalion, 168th Infantry Regiment, 34th Infantry Division, had already launched 3 separate assaults against the German positions on Hill 209, and all 3 had been repulsed with devastating losses. The regiment was part of the 34th Infantry Division, a National Guard unit originally from Iowa, Minnesota, and the Dakotas, that had been in continuous combat since the North Africa landings in 1942. By May of 1944, the division had been ground down by nearly 2 years of fighting, its original personnel killed, wounded, or evacuated, its ranks filled with replacements who lacked the cohesion and experience of the men who had landed in Africa. The 1st Battalion had been tasked with seizing Hill 209 as part of the larger breakout operation, and intelligence had underestimated the strength of German defenses. The first assault, launched in mid-morning, was preceded by a brief artillery preparation that did little more than alert the defenders. As American infantry advanced up the hillside in extended lines, the German machine guns opened fire from positions that had been invisible until that moment. Men fell in the open, others dove for whatever cover existed, and the assault stalled within minutes. Officers and sergeants tried to reorganize to get their men moving again, but the volume of fire was simply too great. The attack collapsed, survivors withdrawing under covering fire, leaving dead and wounded scattered across the volcanic rock. A second assault was ordered for early afternoon, this time with more artillery support and a different axis of advance. The result was identical. The German positions were too well sighted, their fields of fire too complete. Infantry could not close the distance, and those who tried were cut down. The psychological impact of these failures was profound. Soldiers who survive one failed assault and are immediately ordered to make another, knowing the enemy is still in position and still capable of the same devastating fire, experience a form of moral exhaustion that no amount of training can fully prepare them for. They know what is waiting for them, they know the odds, and yet they must rise and advance again because the order has been given. The third assault was marked by catastrophe compounded upon failure. Once again, American infantry moved forward. Once again they were met with withering machine gun fire, and once again the attack ground to a halt. But this time, as survivors huddled in whatever cover they could find, American artillery resumed firing in what should have been a covering barrage to allow withdrawal. The coordinates were wrong, or the timing was miscommunicated, or the observation was faulty. The shells fell not on German positions, but among the American soldiers pinned down in the open. Friendly fire, fratricidal fire, blue on blue, whatever term is used cannot capture the horror of being killed by your own side's artillery while under enemy fire. Men who had survived German machine guns were torn apart by American high explosive. The screams of the wounded, the confusion, the inability to communicate with the guns to cease fire, the knowledge that nowhere was safe, not from the enemy in front and not from the artillery behind, broke the morale of the battalion. Survivors who made it back to American lines were shaken in a way that extended beyond physical exhaustion. They had been asked to assault a fortified position 3 times, they had been repulsed 3 times, and in the final assault they had been killed by their own artillery. The battalion was no longer an effective attacking force. Officers knew it, sergeants knew it, and the men themselves knew it. Yet the position on Hill 209 still had to be taken, because the breakout operation could not succeed with that strongpoint intact. Captain William Galt, known universally as Y, was 24 years old in May of 1944, and he was the battalion S3, the operations officer, a staff position that placed him at the battalion command post rather than with the rifle companies. The S3 is responsible for planning operations, coordinating unit movements, issuing orders, tracking the progress of attacks, and adjusting plans based on battlefield developments. It is a position that requires tactical understanding, organizational skill, and the ability to process information rapidly under stress, but it is not a combat leadership role in the traditional sense. The S3 does not lead platoons or companies into battle. He manages the battle from the command post, receiving reports, updating maps, and advising the battalion commander. Galt had been trained for this role, and by all accounts he was competent and respected. But he had never personally led troops in direct combat, never commanded a rifle platoon or an assault element, never been in the position of standing up under fire and ordering men to follow him. His military experience was administrative and organizational, valuable, but different in kind from the visceral, immediate experience of combat leadership. Yet Galt had observed all 3 failed assaults from the command post, receiving reports from company commanders, tracking casualty figures, watching the attacks stall and collapse, and he had formed a conclusion that would prove tactically correct and personally fatal. Galt had grown up on a cattle ranch in Montana, in the high plains country where the landscape is vast and the nearest neighbor might be miles away. Ranching, particularly cattle ranching on the scale practiced in Montana in the early 20th century, is not simply a matter of feeding and watering livestock. It requires understanding animal behavior, terrain, and movement. Moving cattle from one pasture to another, or driving them toward corrals for branding or shipment, depends on controlling their options. Cattle do not move in straight lines and cannot be pushed directly. They must be guided by limiting their choices, by blocking certain paths and leaving others open, by using the terrain and the position of riders to channel their movement toward the desired destination. A rancher learns to think in terms of geometry, angles, blocked exits, and controlled movement. This is not abstract theory but practical skill developed through years of daily experience. Galt would have learned these principles as a child, riding with his father or ranch hands, learning to position himself to turn a steer, to use fences or natural features to funnel movement, to recognize when an animal was trapped by the terrain and could be approached without risk of it bolting. These skills, learned in a civilian context for entirely peaceful purposes, involved the same underlying principles that govern small unit tactics in combat: control of movement, exploitation of terrain, use of geometry to limit enemy options. Galt recognized, watching the failed assaults on Hill 209, that the German trench system was a geometry problem. Infantry attacking across open ground were exposed and vulnerable, while German soldiers in trenches were protected and could fire from cover. Artillery could not effectively suppress defenders in dugouts, and the moment the barrage lifted, the machine guns resumed fire. The problem was not lack of courage or determination on the part of American infantry. The problem was that the tactical method being used could not succeed against this particular defensive configuration. What was needed was a way to engage the trenches directly, at close range, with a weapon that could fire into the trench itself, rather than across open ground toward it. Galt recommended to the battalion commander that the next assault be supported by armored vehicles, specifically tank destroyers, which could provide direct fire support and engage the trenches at close range. The recommendation was accepted, and a fourth assault was scheduled for the afternoon of May 29th, to be supported by M10 tank destroyers from the 894th Tank Destroyer Battalion. The M10 was not a tank in the conventional sense, but a tank destroyer, a vehicle designed during the early years of American involvement in World War II based on a doctrinal concept that would prove flawed in practice. American armor doctrine in 1942 envisioned mass German tank attacks, blitzkrieg-style armored thrusts that would require a dedicated tank-killing force to counter. The M10 was designed for this role, mounting a powerful 3-inch main gun, the same caliber as the 76mm guns that would later equip Sherman tanks, capable of penetrating most German armor at combat ranges. The vehicle was built on a modified Sherman chassis, giving it reasonable mobility and mechanical reliability. But to save weight and allow the mounting of a larger gun, the armor was thin, only 1 inch on the turret front and less elsewhere, and the turret was open-topped, lacking the overhead protection of a true tank. This design reflected the tank destroyer doctrine. The vehicle was meant to operate from defensive positions or from long range, using its gun to engage enemy armor before the enemy could close to effective range, then relocating before return fire could be concentrated. The open turret allowed for excellent visibility and rapid egress if the vehicle was hit, but it also meant the crew was vulnerable to artillery airbursts, small arms fire from above, and grenades. By 1944, combat experience had revealed that German armored tactics did not match the pre-war American assumptions, and tank destroyers were increasingly used for direct infantry support, a role for which they were not ideally suited, but one they could perform effectively given their firepower. The M10 mounted a 50 caliber Browning M2 HB machine gun on a ring mount at the rear of the turret, intended primarily for anti-aircraft defense, but capable of devastating effect against ground targets. The vehicle weighed 29.6 tons, was crewed by 5 men, and could reach speeds of 30 miles per hour on roads, though far slower across broken terrain. The fourth assault on Hill 209 began in the afternoon of May 29 with a preparatory artillery barrage, followed by infantry advancing with M10 tank destroyers in support. Captain Galt, violating both doctrine and the usual practice for staff officers, personally joined one of the advancing M10s, commanded by First Lieutenant John S. Jerry. There was no tactical reason for a battalion operations officer to accompany a tank destroyer into combat. His place was at the command post, coordinating the overall operation. But Galt had formed a clear idea of what needed to be done, and he evidently believed that his presence was necessary to ensure the plan was executed correctly. He climbed onto the M10, riding on the rear deck, as the vehicle moved forward toward the German positions. The advance was made under fire. German machine guns engaged the infantry, forcing them to take cover, and German artillery began falling on the attacking force, searching for the American vehicles. The M10 continued forward, its 3-inch gun traversing to engage targets, the vehicle buttoned up as much as possible given the open turret. At a range of approximately 400 meters, the crew identified a German 7.5 centimeter PaK-40 anti-tank gun, a towed weapon capable of destroying any Allied tank at that range. The M10 fired, the 3-inch shell striking the PaK-40 and destroying it, eliminating the immediate anti-armor threat. With the German anti-tank gun neutralized, the M10 continued its advance, moving closer to the trench line, far closer than Doctrine would recommend, far closer than would be considered prudent under normal circumstances. The vehicle pushed forward until it was within 50 meters of the German trench system, close enough that the soldiers in the trenches could see the individual features of the men on the vehicle, close enough that grenades could be thrown, close enough that the geometry of the position became absolute. Galt directed the M10 to position itself perpendicular to the trench, maneuvering the vehicle so that its hull physically blocked one of the exits from the trench system. The 29.6-ton vehicle, positioned across the trench line, became an impassable obstacle. A man could not climb over it under fire, could not move it, could not push past it. The 3-inch main gun, with its limited depression, could not fire directly down into the trench, but the gun barrel itself and the bulk of the turret covered another leg of the trench, blocking that avenue of escape. The zigzag design of the trench, which had protected German soldiers from frontal fire and from artillery airburst by limiting line of sight and blast effects, now functioned as a trap. The traverses that prevented enfilade fire along the length of the trench also prevented lateral movement to escape. The German soldiers in that section of trench, approximately 40 men, were confined in a space perhaps 30 meters long and 2 meters deep, with walls that provided no overhead cover, no protection from fire coming from above, and with exits blocked by the mass of the tank destroyer and the threat of its weapons. They could not retreat through the trench because the vehicle blocked the path. They could not climb out of the trench because they would be exposed to small arms fire from the infantry that had accompanied the M10. They could not remain in the trench because what came next made staying impossible. Galt climbed onto the rear deck of the M10, took control of the 50 caliber Browning M2 HB machine gun mounted on its ring mount, and aimed it downward into the trench. The 50 caliber Browning is one of the most successful weapons designs in history, a heavy machine gun that fires a half-inch diameter cartridge with enough energy to penetrate light armor, destroy vehicles, and engage targets at ranges exceeding a mile. Against unprotected human beings at point-blank range, the 50 caliber is not a weapon but an instrument of obliteration. A single round can sever limbs, pass through multiple bodies, and retain enough energy to ricochet off the trench walls. The machine gun fires at a cyclic rate of between 450 and 600 rounds per minute, slower than the German MG-42 but still more than 7 rounds per second, and each round carries enormously more energy than a rifle bullet. Galt opened fire, controlled bursts, sweeping the length of the trench, the muzzle angled downward at nearly 45 degrees, the weapon firing directly into the confined space. The geometry was absolute. The trench walls channeled the fire. The zigzag traverses that had protected the Germans from frontal attack now funneled them into kill zones as Galt adjusted his fire to sweep each section. There was nowhere to hide, no cover within the trench that could stop a .50 caliber round, no way to return fire effectively at a target directly above. The sound would have been overwhelming, the muzzle blast and the crack of rounds impacting stone and earth, the ricochets, the screams. The German soldiers had 3 choices: remain in the trench and die, attempt to climb out and be shot while exposed, or attempt to fight back with rifles and machine pistols against an armored vehicle and a heavy machine gun. None of these choices led to survival. The firing lasted approximately 90 seconds, though accounts vary and exact timing is impossible to establish from surviving records. 90 seconds is a short time in most contexts, but 90 seconds of sustained heavy machine gun fire into a confined space occupied by 40 men is an eternity. Galt fired in controlled bursts, conserving ammunition, adjusting his aim, ensuring that every section of the visible trench was engaged. The .50 caliber ammunition belts fed through the weapon, spent casings ejecting onto the deck of the M10, the barrel heating but not yet reaching the point where a change would be necessary. When Galt ceased fire, it was not because he had run out of targets but because there were no longer any viable targets. The trench was silent. Movement had ceased. American infantrymen who advanced to the position after the M10 withdrew confirmed what the geometry and the firepower had made inevitable. Approximately 40 German soldiers, the entire garrison of that section of trench, were dead. There were no survivors from that position. The bodies lay in the trench where they had fallen, some clustered near the exits that had been blocked, others along the trench line where they had attempted to find cover. The confined space, the blocked exits, the overhead fire, and the overwhelming volume of .50 caliber rounds had allowed no possibility of survival. This was not a firefight in the conventional sense, not a contest of skill or courage or tactical maneuvering. This was the application of industrial firepower into a geometric trap, and the result was as mechanically certain as any process of machinery. The M10 remained stationary too long. In combat, mobility is survival for armored vehicles, and the M10 had violated a fundamental principle by halting in an exposed position within range of German weapons. The vehicle had accomplished its immediate tactical objective. The trench position was neutralized, but the larger battle was ongoing, and German forces responded to the breach in their line. A German counterattack was launched, supported by self-propelled guns, heavier armored vehicles mounting cannons capable of engaging the M10 at range. The exact type of German vehicle involved is not definitively recorded, but given the weapons available to German forces in Italy in May of 1944, it was likely either a Sturmgeschütz self-propelled gun mounting a 75mm cannon, or possibly an 88mm gun on a tracked chassis. Whatever the weapon, it engaged the M10 at a range where the German gun could penetrate the thin armor of the tank destroyer. A shell struck the M10, penetrating through the open top of the turret and detonating inside the vehicle. The interior of an armored vehicle, when penetrated by an anti-tank round, becomes an environment incompatible with human survival. The shell detonates, metal fragments ricochet off the interior walls at velocities sufficient to sever flesh and bone, the overpressure ruptures organs, flammable materials ignite, ammunition cooks off. Captain William Y. Galt was killed instantly or died within moments. Several crew members of the M10 were also killed in the initial hit or in the fire that followed. The vehicle burned, as most armored vehicles do when penetrated and set alight, the ammunition and fuel creating a fire intense enough to make recovery of remains difficult. Surviving crew members who were not killed in the initial explosion evacuated the burning vehicle under fire, some wounded, others able to reach American lines. Galt's body was recovered later, after the position was secured. He was 24 years old, a captain who had spent most of his military career in staff roles, who had never before led men in direct combat, who had grown up on a Montana cattle ranch learning geometry and controlled movement in a context utterly divorced from warfare, and who had applied those lessons to solve a tactical problem that conventional infantry assaults could not overcome. The immediate tactical outcome of the action was the neutralization of the specific trench position that had stopped 3 previous assaults. The German defensive line at that point on Hill 209 was broken. The machine guns were silent. The position was no longer defensible. American infantry were able to advance past the point where they had been pinned down, expanding the lodgment on the hill and reducing the German strongpoint. However, Villa Crochetta itself was not captured on May 29. The German defenders, though reduced, retained other positions on the hill and continued to resist. The battle for Hill 209 continued into the following days, as did the larger battle of the Anzio breakout. The Caesar line, though formidable, was not impregnable, and as American and Allied forces applied pressure across multiple points, the line began to crack. German forces, facing encirclement as Allied units advancing from the south linked up with forces breaking out from Anzio, began a fighting withdrawal toward Rome. The Caesar line collapsed within days of the action on Hill 209, not because of any single action, but because the cumulative pressure of multiple Allied attacks made the position untenable. German forces evacuated Rome on June 4, 1944, declaring it an open city to spare it from destruction, and Allied troops entered the Italian capital to scenes of celebration. The fall of Rome was a significant psychological and political victory, the first Axis capital to be liberated, though strategically the Italian campaign would continue for another year as German forces withdrew to new defensive lines further north. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the United States military conducted extensive after-action reviews and analysis of combat operations, seeking to identify lessons learned and to document actions of exceptional valor or tactical significance. Captain Galt's action on Hill 209 came to the attention of senior officers and historians as an example of innovative tactics and exceptional courage under fire. The decision to use a tank destroyer in close infantry support, the geometric positioning to trap enemy forces, and the willingness of a staff officer to personally lead the action were all recognized as noteworthy. A recommendation was made that Galt be awarded the Medal of Honor, the United States military's highest decoration for valor in combat, reserved for actions that go beyond the call of duty and involve conspicuous gallantry at the risk of life. The recommendation was approved, and in January of 1945, the Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously to Captain William Y. Galt. His widow received the medal in a ceremony that, like so many such ceremonies during the war, was marked by grief and pride in equal measure. She never remarried, carrying the memory of her husband through the decades that followed. The Medal of Honor citation, like many such citations written during or immediately after World War II, contained factual errors that have persisted in official records. The citation misstated details about the weapon Galt used, incorrectly described the number of prior attacks on the position, and attributed actions to Galt that were either exaggerated or misattributed. These errors are not unusual. Combat is chaotic, records are incomplete, witnesses provide conflicting accounts, and the process of writing citations often involves reconstructing events from fragmentary information months or years after the fact. What matters is that the underlying action was real and was documented by multiple sources. Galt did accompany the M10 into combat. The vehicle did engage and neutralize the trench position. Galt did man the 50 caliber machine gun and fire into the trench at close range. Approximately 40 German soldiers were killed in that action, and Galt was subsequently killed when the vehicle was hit by German fire. These facts are not in dispute, even if the specific details recorded in the citation are imperfect. Beyond the immediate recognition of valor, Galt's action had a broader impact on American tactical doctrine. The use of tank destroyers for close infantry support, though not part of their original design or doctrinal role, proved effective when applied correctly. The lesson that armored vehicles could be used to physically control terrain and block enemy movement, rather than simply providing fire support from a distance, was studied and incorporated into training. The recognition that civilian experience, in Galt's case his ranching background and understanding of controlled movement and geometry, could translate directly into effective combat tactics, reinforced a principle that military organizations sometimes forget: that warfare is ultimately about solving problems, and that solutions can come from unexpected sources. The idea that a staff officer, observing failed assaults and recognizing a pattern, could correctly diagnose the problem and propose a solution that line officers had not identified, validated the importance of analytical thinking and willingness to challenge conventional approaches. These lessons, though they did not transform American armor doctrine overnight, contributed to the evolution of tactics in the final year of the war and into the post-war period. Captain William Y. Galt was initially buried in an American military cemetery in Italy, one of thousands of young men laid to rest in foreign soil during the years of World War II. After the war, as the United States began the process of repatriating remains for families who requested it, Galt's body was exhumed and returned to the United States. He was reinterred in Great Falls, Montana, returning to the state where he had grown up, where he had learned the skills on his family's ranch that would prove decisive on a hillside in Italy. His grave is marked, his name is recorded, and his Medal of Honor is documented in official records. A United States Army Reserve Center in Montana bears his name, ensuring that soldiers training there are reminded of his service. Yet despite these memorials, despite the Medal of Honor, despite the tactical significance of his action, Captain William Y. Galt remains largely unknown outside of specialist military historical research and Medal of Honor scholarship. His story is not taught in high school history classes. His name does not appear in popular histories of World War II, and the details of what happened on Hill 209 on May 29, 1944, are known to only a relative handful of people. This obscurity is not unique to Galt. Thousands of men performed acts of exceptional courage during World War II, and the vast majority of those stories have been forgotten by the general public, preserved only in military archives and family memories.